Support comes from Empower Missouri, working to fight poverty and secure basic human needs and equal justice through coalition building and advocacy. Information about involvement at empowermissouri.org/action.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the show, we'll explore efforts to lengthen Missouri's state legislative term limits and why proponents of that move don't think it's a lost cause. First, Republican members of Congress have some big decisions to make over the next few months. President Donald Trump wants lawmakers to pass ambitious legislation that cuts taxes, restricts immigration, and bolsters domestic energy production. But some GOP House members also want to significantly reduce spending in the so-called reconciliation bill, and that could include making major changes to Medicaid, the program that provides health care coverage to the working poor. Joining us now from Republic, Missouri, to talk about the future of Medicaid and the lay of the land in Washington, D.C., is Eric Burlison. The Ozark Republican represents Missouri's 7th congressional district, which takes in places like Springfield, Joplin, and Branson. Congressman Burlison, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Great to be on, Jason.
You've been fairly outspoken that Republicans should not take reductions to Medicaid off the table in the reconciliation bill. So if you had your way, what things would you like to see eliminated or reduced from that program?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that a better way to approach it, I think what is reasonable is to say that if we're really going to save Medicaid for the people that truly need it, then we must make some reforms to the program. And that is because, a program that once had rules in place, under the Clinton administration, work requirements, really kind of set the tone policy-wise that encourage people that if you are capable of working and you're not disabled, you don't have kids living in the home that you have to maintain, you're not an elderly individual, there's no reason in the world that you shouldn't be working. We don't think that it's good to create a cycle of dependency for people who should be out producing and so by putting in work requirements, which is what Bill Clinton supported, signed into law, I think that set a right balance and a right tone. Unfortunately, when the Biden became president and under the COVID rules, he signed about 13 or more executive orders that lifted those work requirements that were once very bipartisan in nature. And the result is that we're spending at least $200 to $300 billion a year more in federal spending than we did before, and that has only exacerbated the deficit, which now sits at $2 trillion in basic spending that we are adding to the national debt. So I think that if we're going to address our national debt and our deficit, we've got to have some of these discussions on the table.
I listened to your Fresh Freedom podcast last week, and you spent a decent amount of time criticizing Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And that stipulates that the federal government provides 90% of the cost to pay for people up to 138% of the federal poverty level to be on the program, which is about $26,500 a year for an individual. Would that be something that you would like to end in this reconciliation bill?
Yeah, there's probably, and I'm going to set reasonable expectations. That's probably, there's a difference between what I would do if I could wave a magic wand, because I'm very fiscally conservative, and I probably would hit that. But that is not likely. But what I do think that we should do is have a reasonable conversation about whether or not the federal government can afford to continue to match at 90%. And the reason is that when we ironically, for people that are able-bodied, young, working-age adults, we're paying the state 90% of their costs. But when it comes to people that are disabled, when it comes to the blind, to the elderly, we're paying around 60%. So we're paying the state more money to put able-bodied young adults on Medicaid, on the government program. So I think that's out of whack. We need to rebalance that. And what the result of this, Jason, is that states, because we're at such a high match at 90%, states have gotten very good at playing a shell game where they go to the carriers and the hospital networks and the systems, and then they negotiate a higher price, and then in that negotiation, they agree to tax themselves more to the state. So the state, it doesn't ultimately cost the state anymore when they raise their prices, but the end result is that they're drawing more money from the federal government than they did before. And so we kind of need to end that practice. I think that there's some responsible ways that we can do that without affecting anyone's benefits on Medicaid, and or kicking anybody off that truly needs it.
I do want to, even though you said that this may not make it into the reconciliation bill, I do want to just mention that Missouri's Medicaid expansion program is in the Constitution. So if the 90-10 match did end, neither lawmakers nor Governor Mike Kehoe could just reduce eligibility by fiat. Missouri voters would have to make that decision. And I talked with your former colleague, Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman Lincoln Huff, where he estimated that state lawmakers could have a roughly $750 million budgetary hole if, say, the federal government only pays 60% of federal Medicaid expansion's costs. Here is Senator Huff.
Jason, that is not anything to sneeze at. I mean, we're walking into, Kehoe's first year, and he's spending down, like in his proposed budget, he's spending down a roughly $3.5 billion carryover that we have down to about $1.5 billion.
Mm-hmm. So
if you add on top of that another $750 million of general revenue that the state's got to make up, we're going to be in a tough situation.
That was Senate Appropriations Chairman Lincoln Huff talking with me about the impact of ending the 90-10 federal Medicaid expansion match. What is your response to your former Missouri Senate colleague there?
Yeah, I've got a couple of responses. One is that I've not heard of any of the suggestions that it be done immediately. If we're going to rebalance that match, that it would be done given an extended period of time to let states adjust, and then or have time to adjust. In addition, I've heard of ways that it could be phased in, that the change to that formula could be phased in. But I would also, just say, and we can't let the state of Missouri, and because the voters put something into effect, be the tail that wags the dog for the federal government, and it's been a massive program that impacts all the other 49 states.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk more broadly about the first couple months of the Trump presidency. And since this is top of mind, I'll start with tariffs. He has been touting tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. But I've read statements and tweets from Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul criticizing Congress for not taking a more active role in approving these economically significant presidential actions. Should Congress have to approve significant tariffs before they go into effect?
I think that the president has that power under Article 2. I think that he can raise and lower tariffs under that authority. I think that it's necessary to kind of rebalance some of our trade imbalances, and so I think that his approach that he has decided to make, which is a reciprocating approach. If the other nation state is tariffing us, then we can't continue to let that happen without a response. The end result is going to be an unbalanced result. So if we can if we can encourage those other nations to reduce their tariffs by saying we'll match whatever level that you're going to, tariff us, we will tariff you. I think that would encourage a lot of nations to reduce their tariffs on the United States.
And tariffs are not the only thing Trump has done in the first couple of months. There's been lots and lots and lots of executive actions, especially on spending and governmental jobs. And while polls have shown that Trump has a lot of support with GOP voters in general, you've seen a lot of anger at town halls for Republican members of Congress, including your Missouri colleague Mark Alford. North Carolina Republican Congressman Rick Hudson even suggested GOP officials should stop having in-person town halls. What do you make of the backlash to some of Trump's actions? And what do you think of Congressman Hudson's suggestion that Republicans shouldn't do these town halls anymore?
Yeah, I'll tell you firsthand. I think that the town halls create a dynamic where only political nut jobs show up whenever you do a political town hall event, and so you're just asking for a in-person version of the Twitter hellscape that sometimes exists, right? But normal people who go about their daily lives do not choose to go to these events. You're creating a dynamic where you're just inviting a very verbally hostile scenario.
Hold on, Congressman. I just got to ask you, are you saying that everybody who shows up to these town halls are wacky nut jobs? Aren't there some people with legitimate complaints or concerns that they want to talk about?
There's certainly probably are some people that have got some legitimate concerns. And I'm not saying that a legislator should avoid their constituents, but what I would say is that there's a way to do that without creating that dynamic. And what I do, for example, is I find every community civic group that I can, whether it's the League of Women Voters or like the Rotary Club, go to any organization that's meeting that I can find. When you show up at those meetings and you speak and you answer questions, these are nonpartisan groups, but they are a cross-section of the community, and you're able to get real input and that's not motivated by the fringe. And so, to me, that is more important than creating a dynamic that you're inviting all of the most extreme people to come to. In addition, I do telephone town halls, but I think that at the end of the day, what we've learned is that a lot of this is not organic. A lot of the people that are coming are part of a system that's designed to create a spectacle.
But we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to talk about a bill that you've sponsored called the Life at Conception Act, which, among other things, states hereby declares that the right to life guaranteed by the Constitution is vested in each human being. I just got to ask, because I read the entire bill, would anybody be able to get an abortion in this country for any reason if this passed, even if a woman's life was in danger?
No, I mean, it would not. It would certainly be able to protect the life of the mother. But at the end of the day, it reflects what I and a lot of individuals believe, which is that the moment that life at the moment of conception, you have an entirely new human being, someone whose DNA will not match anyone else's in previous history or future history. And so I think that it's important to reflect that, and I think that that science is moving in a direction that I think that our goal should not be. Our goal should be to make it so that abortion is an absurd option. It's something that's not necessary. That ensuring that we make it easy for mothers to carry out the full term of their pregnancy.
Now, one of the reasons your bill caught my attention is your position on abortion, which, correct me if I'm wrong, like you only think that abortion should be legal for life of the mother. You don't believe in rape and incest exceptions based off talking with you in the past. I just want to make sure that I'm accurately summing up your opinion, correct?
I do, and the reason is that I know individuals. In fact, that he had a staffer was that was the result of that. Was the result of a rape and incest event. And so when I look at that person and I think, is that individual any less of a human being than anyone else? And my answer is no. I think we cannot, if you value the life of the individual that's been created, then you have to, in my opinion, the way in which they came about into this world is not something that we should judge a person by.
Okay, so here's the reason I asked that question in the last 30, 45 seconds or a minute. President Trump believes in exceptions, and he's also was quoted during the campaign that Florida's 6-week abortion ban was too short. Is your position on this different from the president?
Oh, absolutely. I think that Trump has made it clear he's probably to the left of me on this issue, and I understand. But at the end of the day, this is my personally held view. It's something that I don't know that I'm just personally looking through it. I feel like that this is a more stable ground for me logically to land, and so I fully recognize that it puts me a little bit to the right of some people.
Representative Eric Burlison represents Missouri's 7th Congressional District, which includes cities like Springfield, Joplin, and Branson. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason.
When we come back, we'll talk with a Missouri lawmaker who wants to make a major change to the state's term limits. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. More than 30 years ago, Missourians made a momentous decision about the Missouri General Assembly. They enacted strict term limits, allowing someone to serve 8 years in the Missouri House and 8 years in the Missouri Senate. That 1992 initiative came at a time when Missouri House and Senate members often served for decades. They accumulated a tremendous amount of power and influence in the process. Greg Upchurch, a Manchester attorney who chaired the successful ballot item campaign, says the fact the initiative passed with over 75% of the vote showed that Missourians didn't want their state lawmakers to hang around the state capitol in perpetuity.
People don't like politicians, and this is a way to limit the power of politicians. It doesn't mean that they have to stay out of politics. No, they just have to stay out of that particular office once they've been limited. So you can run for dog catcher if you want. We don't care. You just can't run for the legislature again.
But with the passage of time, more and more people from both of the state's political parties have criticized these legislative limits. Joining us now from Jefferson City is one of those legislators, State Representative Peggy McGaugh. The Carrollton Republican introduced a ballot item that could allow someone to serve as much as 16 years in one legislative chamber. Representative McGaugh, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
What prompted you to introduce your proposal to change Missouri's term limits?
We felt like when this passed on the ballot in November of 92, changed the Constitution, Article 3, Section 8, as you know, to 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate for a total of 16. Probably back then, the people thought that it would be a good thing, and it would push out maybe some of the things that was going on back then. But what's happened is that we now have a lack of experience, a lack of institutional knowledge, and it's been a detriment. So I just think that when you think about a successful business and its CEO, would you, when it came to would you be better or worse off if you were forced to fire the CEO at the end of the year, successful or not? You don't want to be firing a good legislator if they're doing you a good job just because it happens, their time ran out. So I think it's time that we think about the fact that there are many, many good people who need to stay around longer because we need their expertise. Some of the policy areas that it has shown that we need to keep people around is in the budget, in the foundation formula for the education, which is very, very important, in Medicaid, that has changed immensely even since I've been down here in 2018, and in elections. So I think if people had the ability to stay longer, that they would be better prepared for what's in front of them.
I spoke with Greg Upchurch, who was the leader of the 1992 amendment putting legislative term limits in place, which you alluded to in your response to my first question. And I talked with him about your proposal, and needless to say, he was not very enthusiastic about it. Here is Greg Upchurch commenting on your ballot item.
In 16 years, you can send somebody off to first grade and go to their graduation from college. That's a long time.
That was Greg Upchurch, a Manchester attorney who helped pass Missouri's 1992 legislative term limits amendment. What's your reaction to his comments?
Well, I appreciate, and they worked really hard. I think that passed the initiative petition that year passed with over 70, maybe even 75%.
Yeah,
it
was
vote.
over 75% of the vote. I
Okay.
had to double check that while I was researching this topic, but continue.
And I think, though, there was a lot of turmoil in the state at that time. And I know you were a very young man then. I was a county clerk in northern Missouri, and
I was 8 years old and living in Illinois, representative. I was not paying attention.
Okay, I'll give you that. I was a lot younger then, and I was just starting out not starting out, but I was in a political career, but raising children, so I wasn't active in politics. But I do remember a man that had a lot of power up in the north, that then the power made him also be a little greedy, perhaps. And so that initiative petition came fresh off of all that uprisal. And I do believe that maybe the people had that, and maybe some parts of Washington, perhaps. Voters get what's happening at the state house and what's happening at the federal house confused sometimes. And so when they went into the polls, vote, let's get rid of those scoundrels. So I think that the people that realize that their reps are good, doing good things down here, might consider it. It would. You're right, and he's right. It might be a hard sell, but we've got time. We've got time to get it out there. Now, first and foremost, I want you to know this is not self-serving. I'm not doing this for myself. I don't intend to. This is my last term. I'm not running for office again. I don't intend to do that.
Yeah, and that was actually going to get to another question of mine. This would not affect legislators who are currently in place. It would not be retroactive. Why did you decide not to make it retroactive?
I thought it was best for the people that are here now to help pass it, to be able to show to people that they're not trying to do something for themselves. They're not trying to be selfish. And I think it needs to be close to the next time of the next redistricting. I served on the census committee, and I know the numbers are shifting. My own district shifted enormously. I used to have Ray, Carroll, and Sheraton counties, and the northern area, the northern part of Missouri, is losing population so much. And so I now serve Carroll, Livingston, and Lynn, and a portion of Ray. And so those numbers are going to shift again. We're not gaining population. So they need to know where they're going to be filing. I didn't file this bill for anyone in particular. I filed it for the state of Missouri because I think the state of Missouri needs to know what's happening down here, that there's more money being spent because the people serving here on budget and on the school, the education committees have nothing. Term limits has caused the inexperience. Mm-hmm. It affects the legislators' ability to develop the expertise necessary to find the best solutions for Missouri. And that's my opinion, and it was the opinion of the other people that help with this. Now, the other component, as you know, is that I limit the how long leadership can also serve. And I think that was part, as we talked about, the big push to have this passed back in 92.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to just make sure they know what we're talking about. When the 1992 Term Limits Amendment passed, that was when Bob Griffin, who is from Cameron, Missouri, which is somewhat close to Carrollton, had been speaker for, I think, over a decade at that point, and he, even in 1992, he had been kind of castigated as this all-powerful boss lord, essentially. He eventually resigned and went to jail for corruption in 1996.
And that's exactly who I was speaking of, about the corruption. And yes, that's up in my area. And there's still people that, talk about that, and it's a valid point. And can that happen again? I certainly hope not. And so with this provision, it wouldn't, hopefully, because the limit would be the length of time any legislator can serve as Speaker of the House and President Pro Tem of the Senate, as no more than 2 terms in the House and no more than 1 term in the Senate. Mm-hmm. So that's very restrictive.
So this would have to go to voters if it passes out of the Missouri House and the Missouri Senate. And we got a lot of comments from listeners on this subject, including this one from the hippie welder on TikTok. They can get term limits extended when they get our trust back. In my time growing up and spending time in Jeff City, only 1 rep has ever had my support. Once they remember that, they can represent us in our decisions. Are term limits amazing? No, but they can light a fire under someone to get stuff done. I would imagine there are a lot of people that feel the same way as that commenter and are going to see something like this and be like, no, I don't like this idea. There should be a limited amount of time that legislators should be able to serve. How are you going to be able to convince people, including people that put term limits in place in 1992, that it's time for a change?
Well, and that's a good point. So on the flip side is right now, if you know that you're going to be out the door in the next couple of years, what's the incentive to work hard and listen to your voters? I mean, you can just skate. So, Mr. Hippie is right. For the people that are down here for the right reasons, they want to listen to their people. They want to gain the trust. But the people that maybe, are just down here for politics, that don't want to write good bills and listen to their people and represent the area that they're from, who needs to take care of that are the voters back home.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's exactly, I was working for the county clerk before me back in 92, and that's exactly what he said. Elderly gentleman who said, we have term limits if people would, really listen to what's going on and look around and vet. Even back then, vetting was a thing, vote the guys out. If they're doing a terrible job, don't vote for them again. That's how you term limit people.
And there are people who responded to this prompt about term limits who totally agree with you. On Fortune's Wheel on Reddit writes, term limits are terrible. It creates weak systems dependent on outside influence to help legislators with limited experience navigate the legislative process. By the time they gain knowledge and expertise, they're kicked out. I can't think of a single good reason for term limits. So On Fortune's Wheel brings up a worthwhile point. If term limits are so destructive and corrosive, why not just get rid of them altogether and allow somebody to serve 30, 40 years in the House or 30, 40 years in the Senate? Like, why did you decide only to go like halfway between the two extremes, basically.
Well, I felt like with the electorate that we have now, what's going on in the federal and the state level, that we should probably take baby steps toward that.
Because you don't think that getting rid of term limits entirely would pass.
That is correct.
When I put out this social media prompt about term limits, I got a lot of responses from former legislators. And one of the people is former Senator Delbert Scott, who served 18 years in the Missouri House and 8 years in the Missouri Senate. So he got to see both worlds, basically, the term-limited world and the non-term limited world. This is what he wrote. There comes a time to go home, as the natural tendency is to think the seat you occupy is yours. In reality, the seat belongs to citizens, and you are a temporary holder of the office. I don't anticipate any change in the term limit structure. There are plenty of capable citizens to fill legislative seats. So what do you say to the idea that term limits instill in legislators that this is not a forever job, and that when your time is up, you have to go do something else with your life rather than hang your entire identity around being a Missouri legislator?
Well, I worked with Delbert Scott as a county clerk. Very good man. He did a great job. He's the epitome of the ones that did good work down here. So I appreciate what he said and agree with what he said. So the other thing with term limits, and I might add, the level of salary that we make here, is that we are not necessarily grabbing the brightest and the best. And we are gearing toward really, really young people coming out of college or retired, like myself, have actually done their career, able to draw their retirement from another job, another career, and then this is their swan song into Social Security. Because a young man raising a family, this is not a good occupation to make what we make and be away from home.
And I don't disagree with that, but that seems like more of the fact that you make like $39,000 a year rather than term limits. And you may be getting to that point, and I just needlessly interrupted you, but like,
right.
But like that seems like an entirely separate issue. Like California has term limits, but they pay their legislators much more than Missouri, so you get a better crop of legislators, even though there's term limits. What would you say to that?
Well, it's all somewhat related, and what you said about does this define people? It's very sad to me if someone comes down here and totally changes their personality once you put representative in front of their name. And I agree with you that it shouldn't be that way. You should come down here to represent your people, not to gain a title. And now that we have term limits, you should come down here and work fast to get something done. I don't want to go back to the days where someone like Bob Griffin becomes a king and they become so powerful that, they become corrupt. So I think 16 years is a good level that is where we would start.
State Representative Peggy McGaugh is a Carrollton Republican who sponsored a ballot item allowing someone to spend up to 16 years in either the Missouri House or the Missouri Senate. Representative, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
When we return, we'll get a broader perspective about national term limits and whether there's enough momentum to undo them. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. In our last segment, we discussed an effort from a Republican lawmaker to allow someone to serve up to 16 years in the Missouri House or the Missouri Senate. Getting that through the legislature is an open question. but getting voter approval may be an even tougher climb. 16 states have legislative term limits, and they were often adopted through a ballot initiative with widespread support. That makes some longtime Missouri political figures, like former Lieutenant Governor Peter Kinder, doubt whether voters will ever change the 8-year limits on serving in the House or Senate.
I could make you an argument on either side, but I think it's academic because the people grafted this onto our Constitution by a 72% vote, supermajority, and it's not going anywhere.
So are term limits here to stay in Missouri and elsewhere, or could they be tossed into the legislative trash heap? Thad Kousser is a political science professor at the University of California, San Diego. He's the author of Term Limits and the Dismantling of State Legislative Professionalism, which closely examined the impact of legislative term limits across the country. Professor Kousser, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks very much for having me.
As I mentioned, there are 16 states that have adopted term limits for state legislative posts. When did you find that this idea started to gain a little bit of traction across the country?
Term limits is this ancient idea that's been around as long as ancient Athens, and Aristotle actually argued for it. We actually had term limits in the first American government under the Articles of Confederation, but then the Philadelphia Convention, it's abandoned, it goes away, it's not in our Constitution, and it really disappears from American political life until 1990. So this was a year, much like 2024, where there's really an anti-incumbent fervor across the country. And that's when the modern term limits movement gets moving. And it's passed in, I believe, 4 states in that year and quickly spreads across the country and even gets included in Newt Gingrich's contract with America. And it's proposed but not passed by the U.S. House in that year.
In some respects, I was kind of surprised that more states hadn't adopted some sort of state legislative term limits. Doing a little bit of research, some states have actually repealed them either through the legislative or judicial action. Why do you think that this idea hasn't caught on to all 50 states?
Yeah, it's a great question with a simple answer. Legislators don't like to enact term limits on themselves. And so you see it happen in states that have the initiative process. So almost all of the initiative process states originally passed it. 6 of them get overturned, 4 in the courts, 2 by state legislators, leaving the 16 states. So it essentially filled up everywhere, but hardly had any success where legislators had a monopoly on the lawmaking process through a lack of the initiative process.
Missouri has a limit of being able to serve 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. How does that sort of setup compare to other states?
That's the most frequent kind of term limits we have in the state. So that's what you see in places like Maine, Colorado, Florida, where they called their initiative the 8 is Enough initiative. Places like Ohio, South Dakota. The real difference is between these kind of 2 sets of term limits. One is the set of states, the most common ones, that give you a certain number of years in the House, a certain number of years in the Senate. But there's another group of states, including Oklahoma, and then Arkansas moved into this category, and California moved in this category, which says, you know what, we're going to put a total term limit of 12 years, but let you serve that in whichever House you can convince voters to elect you to.
And in fact, the other guest we had on this show, State Representative Peggy McGaugh, is proposing that exact idea, allowing somebody to serve up to 16 years in the House or 16 years in the Senate, but no more than 16 years. I guess my question from a practical standpoint, states that have done that sort of arrangement, has there been any tangible benefits compared to states with like a strict 8-year in each chamber term limit, like Missouri?
Yeah, we've been watching this very closely in California, and I think that this change, which happened more than a decade ago in our state, has brought exactly the benefits it was intended to bring, right? So the idea was there was just too much chaos under the old system. California had 6 years in the state assembly, 8 years in the Senate. That meant once people got into the House, they were immediately looking for the next place to move up to, the next committee to get. And then very quickly they're thinking about, what am I going to do when I leave, and trying to find a different office or position in the administrative branch or with a lobbying firm. And so that sort of 6 years, and I guess the argument would be that the 8 years that Missouri has just wasn't enough for people to do the job that they were sent by voters to do. And so if you could let them have a career in one of those houses and spend the entire time, you'd see both some of the keeping of some of the institutional knowledge, letting people get on a committee, develop expertise, move policy in that realm, take on the bigger issues of the state year in and year out, but then be gone in 12 years and bringing in a new person and fresh perspective, so that they would have time to, so that the legislature would have the benefit of turnover that term limits was intended to bring, without the chaos that they were creating.
Given that there are so many ordinary people who follow Missouri politics who have told me that they think term limits are the worst thing that has ever happened to us, you might be like, how did over 70% of voters in 1992 approve this? And I guess my response would be that there are also a lot of people like Staniforth J on Instagram who wrote to me, 8 years seems like plenty of time to make a difference and move on. We don't need lifetime politicians like we have in Washington. Is what you just heard a pretty common sentiment among voters who think term limits are a good idea?
Yes, I think Americans are suspicious of politicians, and the idea that, again, as I said, goes back to Aristotle, who said that each should rule in turn over all. The idea that people should only spend a bit of time in government and then go back and live under the laws that they have passed is really appealing. I think where you see public opposition is people who look up close at a Capitol and watch what turnover does, and know how long it kind of takes for people to get into a subject area, develop some expertise, and then if by the time they've developed that expertise, they're close to being a lame duck and nobody else is going to respect them or cooperate with them, you see the real consequences that brings for lawmaking. So term limits passed by really strong margins in nearly every state that they're proposed because they're so intuitively appealing, but the reality hasn't quite matched the full goals of term limits proponents.
We got a couple of interesting comments from people who had alternatives to term limits. Friend of the show, Reese Ellis, writes on Instagram, the thing that would make the most sense is an age limit, not a term limit. We already have mandatory retirement ages for judges in Missouri. The reason we have these crazy primaries for state senate is because you have a bunch of people not wanting to, quote, miss their shot. Do any states in America have an age limit, or is it pretty much the same as in Washington, D.C., that if you're 105 years old and you decide to run for the Senate and win, you can serve at 105 years old?
Yes, we don't have age limits. We let voters make that test of whether someone has the energy, mental competence, and perspective to serve, and we don't use age is only a number in American politics.
I guess that point that Reese brought up, I think, is taking a little bit more of a prominent place in people's minds. There's all these instances that you see in Congress of somebody serving into their 90s or their 80s and really not having as much vigor or energy as they did when they were younger. Is this something that may catch a little bit of fire? Or conversely, could that idea be really unappealing to a subset of voters who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s and may find that idea profoundly offensive?
And guess what? Who turns out at a really high rate, right? Voters in their 60s and 70s. Yeah, I think we've had these discussions. Certainly in California, we had them around Senator Dianne Feinstein before she passed away while serving in office. And there have been these conversations about the U.S. Supreme Court that are very serious. But I don't think any of them are really likely to move ahead, both because of that overall idea that voters can decide and that every case is different, and that you do have politicians who are old who can be really vigorous. Look at President Trump, love him or hate him. This is somebody who has a lot of energy and vigor, and so I think the approach that we've taken over and over again after hand-wringing conversations is let the voters decide in this democracy.
Some would say he has a little bit too much energy and vigor depending on the topic, but that's a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
I want to actually talk about the flip side of states that do not have term limits. And perhaps the most notorious example is across the river from St. Louis in Illinois. I'm an Illinois native, and Mike Madigan started being speaker before I was born. I'm 40 years old, so he was speaker for the vast majority of my life. And he was recently found guilty of corruption. We had a situation in Missouri before my time. Missouri House Speaker Bob Griffin, who was the speaker for many years, also went to jail for corruption. Do these examples provide kind of a pushback against the wisdom of not having term limits because it entrenches people so much that they eventually feel they're invincible and they start doing a lot of criming?
Yes, when I spent some time in Springfield, Illinois, interviewing people for this project, I learned that in Illinois we say sometimes a governor serves another term, and that doesn't mean in the state house. But that's not unique to. So first, there's absolutely defining that term limits leads to much greater turnover of leaders. People serve for shorter amounts of time. But on the flip side, often those leaders have really strong powers while they're in office because everyone who's elected there kind of came in under them and owes their election to them. People like Larry Householder, who was a speaker in Ohio, who was immensely powerful. So it doesn't change. Term limits don't take away speakers' power. They have them serve less time in office. What I'd have to say, sort of, and I haven't done any systematic study of the link between term limits and corruption verdicts in the United States, but we have had, unfortunately, our fair share in California in the term limits era of legislators who have been convicted of corruption, and you see this in both term limited and non-term limited states.
Former State Senator Ryan McKenna is not a fan of term limits, but he did add this in his comment that I found was interesting. I think a term limit on how long a legislator can be in leadership would be a better way to think of term limits. Think speakers, majority, minority floor leaders, pro tem, budget chairs. I can see both sides of the argument, but I personally thought government and the Capitol worked better pre-term limits. What do you think about this idea?
Yeah, so this is an idea after Congress failed to move forward towards a constitutional amendment at the federal level. The Republican Party imposed committee chair term limits on its own members, at least initially. And the idea there was it was really that entrenched power where someone almost had a policy realm as their own fiefdom in some Congresses that was a big problem. And you didn't need to throw them out of office and kind of deny their voters the ability to vote for someone of their choosing. But if you rotated committee positions, that would be a way of spreading power across districts, across legislators, across individuals. So there's some precedent for that, and there are reasonable arguments for that. The arguments against would be this is exactly where you want to have experienced leaders in a committee, where they're often bringing in experienced staff, and that's where policy work and policy development gets done, and where the expertise of a long-serving member could be most useful to the public generally.
Thad Kousser is a political science professor at the University of California, San Diego. He's the author of Term Limits and the Dismantling of State Legislative Professionalism. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.